Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who laugh the hardest when we inherit something worthless. Daniel Reeves felt that sting when his own family mocked the rusted jet. His estranged father left him in a forgotten field. Everyone called it scrap metal. His siblings wanted him to sell it for parts. His wife quietly worried he was chasing another failed dream. But when Daniel started taking apart that old aircraft, he found hidden compartments and strange markings carved into the metal. Deep inside, the tale was a sealed vault with documents about his father's secret past, papers that revealed a Cold War mission and a missing fortune worth $200 million. What Daniel didn't know was that dangerous people had been hunting for that money for decades. But did his father really hide clues to find it, or was this just another cruel joke from beyond the grave? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Robert Reeves's funeral, Daniel stood in his cramped kitchen, staring at a memorial service program that barely filled half a page. 3 paragraphs. 47 years of life reduced to basic facts, survived by 3 children, preceded in death by his wife Margaret, services at Whitmore Funeral Home. No mention of hobbies, achievements, or the kind of man he'd been. The sparse details felt like a final insult to a relationship that had never found its footing. Daniel Reeves had inherited his father's hands, thick fingers, permanent grease stains, calluses that told stories of honest work. At 42, he'd spent 2 decades as a mechanic in Millbrook, Indiana, a town where everyone knew your business and most folks had given up on dreams bigger than their mortgage payments. His garage sat on the edge of town, a converted barn where he coaxed life back into aging pickup trucks and family sedans that had seen better decades. The irony wasn't lost on him that he fixed things for a living, yet had never been able to repair the distance between himself and his father. "You're going to be late," Sarah called from the hallway, her voice carrying that particular tone wives develop when they're managing both sympathy and exasperation. She appeared in the doorway, straightening his tie with practiced efficiency. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read his silences, and this morning's quiet was heavier than most. Sarah Elizabeth Porter had married Daniel Reeves when they were both 22, and foolish enough to believe love could overcome practical concerns like money and stability. She'd kept her accounting job at the county clerk's office when their first child arrived, then their second, because Daniel's dreams of expanding the garage never quite matched their monthly expenses. At 41, she carried herself with the dignified weariness of a woman who'd learned to be both optimist and realist, often in the same conversation. "The kids ready?" Daniel asked, though he could hear Tommy and Lisa arguing upstairs about whether 16-year-old Tommy had to attend his grandfather's funeral when he'd only met the man a handful of times. "They're ready enough," Sarah replied, which meant she'd negotiated a temporary ceasefire. "Daniel, about this inheritance thing, we don't even know what it is yet." "That's what worries me." She smoothed his collar one more time. "Your father wasn't exactly forthcoming about his affairs when he was alive. I can't imagine death made him more generous." The drive to Whitmore Funeral Home took 12 minutes, past the grain elevator and the defunct Woolworths, through the heart of a town that had watched its children leave for bigger cities and better opportunities. Daniel's siblings had both made that journey, Rebecca to Chicago, where she sold insurance and wore suits that cost more than Daniel's monthly groceries, and Michael to Indianapolis, where he managed a chain of auto parts stores and spoke in corporate buzzwords that made family dinners feel like business meetings. They stood together in the receiving line, an awkward trio who shared DNA and little else. Rebecca checked her phone intermittently, fielding calls she deemed too important to ignore for their father's funeral. Michael made small talk with a handful of attendees, his easy smile masking whatever complicated feelings he harbored about their father's passing. The service itself lasted 37 minutes. Pastor Williams, who'd never met Robert Reeves, delivered generic comfort about eternal rest and reunion with loved ones. Daniel noticed how few people filled the chapel, maybe 20 souls, mostly neighbors who attended funerals out of small-town obligation rather than genuine grief. After the burial, they gathered at Brennan's family restaurant for what Rebecca called settling the estate, though Daniel suspected there wasn't much estate to settle. Their father had lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, drove a 15-year-old Buick, and worked construction until his arthritis forced early retirement. Attorney Harold Fitzgerald had been handling legal matters in Millbrook for 40 years, and his appearance suggested he'd been wearing the same brown suit for most of them. He spread papers across the restaurant table with the solemnity of a man who delivered both windfalls and disappointments to 3 generations of local families. "Your father's will is straightforward," Fitzgerald began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of legal precision. "The house and its contents go to Rebecca as the eldest. The savings account, about $8,000, is split between Michael and Daniel. There are a few personal items designated for specific recipients." Daniel half listened as Fitzgerald detailed the division of furniture, tools, and keepsakes. He'd expected nothing significant. His father had been a man of simple means and simpler expressions of affection. The surprise came at the end of the reading. "Daniel, your father left you what he called the aircraft and associated property located at Millbrook Municipal Airfield." Fitzgerald removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "I should mention, I advised him against this particular bequest. The aircraft in question hasn't been maintained in decades. The county's been after him for years about storage fees and property violations." Rebecca looked up from her phone for the first time in 20 minutes. "What aircraft? Dad didn't own a plane." "Apparently, he did." Fitzgerald consulted his notes. "A 1962 Cessna 310, registered under his name since 1963. It's been sitting in a field behind the old terminal building for as long as anyone can remember." Michael laughed, the sound sharp in the restaurant's quiet. "Danny gets a broken-down airplane. That sounds about right. There are significant back taxes and storage fees." Fitzgerald continued. "The county's prepared to take possession if those aren't addressed within 90 days. I'd estimate the total liability at around $12,000. Daniel felt Sarah's hand tighten on his arm. $12,000 was more than they had in their savings account, more than they could afford to lose on their father's final riddle. "Can we see it?" Daniel asked, ignoring his siblings' exchange of meaningful glances. Fitzgerald provided directions to the municipal airfield, a forgotten strip of cracked asphalt where flying lessons had ended sometime in the 1980s. The terminal building stood empty, its windows boarded, weeds growing through the foundation cracks. They found the aircraft exactly where Fitzgerald had indicated, behind the building, partially hidden by 20 years of volunteer vegetation. Daniel's first glimpse explained his siblings' amusement. The Cessna sat like a wounded bird, its white paint faded to the color of old bones, moss covering the wings, landing gear half sunk into earth that had reclaimed its share of the machine. "Jesus, Dad," Rebecca muttered. "Even from the grave, you're sticking Danny with your problems." The twin-engine plane had once been beautiful. Daniel could see that beneath the decay, someone had loved this aircraft enough to modify it extensively. The passenger compartment showed signs of custom work, reinforced panels, additional storage, modifications that suggested purpose beyond simple transportation. "It's actually in better shape than it looks," Daniel found himself saying, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to defend the machine. "The engines are protected. Structure seems solid. It's mostly cosmetic damage." Michael kicked at one of the deflated tires. "Cosmetic damage and about $50,000 in restoration costs. Danny, cut your losses. Sign it over to the county and walk away." But Daniel was already moving around the aircraft, his mechanic's eye cataloging details others missed. The modifications weren't random. They followed a logic he couldn't yet understand. Extra fuel tanks, reinforced cargo areas, communication equipment beyond what civilian pilots typically needed. Sarah watched him with the expression she wore when he brought home broken lawn mowers and promised to restore them. "Daniel, we can't afford this." "I know." He ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the solid construction beneath the surface rust. "But maybe there's something here worth preserving." Rebecca's phone buzzed with another call. "I have to get back to Chicago. Michael, can you handle the house clean-out?" "Already arranged." Michael jangled his keys. "Danny, seriously, don't get romantic about this piece of junk. Dad left you a problem, not a gift." After his siblings drove away, Daniel and Sarah stood alone with the aircraft. The afternoon sun slanted through the overgrown trees, casting shadows that made the plane look even more abandoned. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "I'm thinking about the modifications, about why Dad never mentioned owning an airplane, about what kind of man buys a plane and lets it sit in a field for 40 years. I'm thinking about $12,000 we don't have." Daniel nodded, understanding her concern. They'd struggled financially since the recession hit Millbrook's manufacturing base. His garage generated enough income to cover their basic expenses, but luxuries like airplane restoration were beyond their reach. Yet, something about the aircraft called to him. Perhaps it was the quality of the modifications, the careful craftsmanship that spoke of serious purpose. Perhaps it was the mystery of his father's hidden ownership. Or perhaps it was simply the stubborn streak that had kept Daniel in Millbrook when smarter men moved away. "What if there's value here we're not seeing?" he asked. "What if Dad left this for a reason?" Sarah sighed, a sound that carried 20 years of similar conversations. "And what if it's just another one of his disappointments? Daniel, your father wasn't exactly known for his sound financial decisions." She was right, of course. Robert Reeves had been a man of modest means and questionable judgment. The airplane probably represented nothing more than an old man's forgotten dream, abandoned when reality intruded on fantasy. But as they walked back to their truck, Daniel found himself looking over his shoulder at the aircraft. In the fading light, it almost seemed purposeful in its solitude, like a secret waiting 40 years to be discovered. That evening, after Tommy and Lisa had gone to their rooms and Sarah had settled at the kitchen table with her crossword puzzle, Daniel sat in his workshop behind the garage. The space smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, familiar scents that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, they couldn't quiet the questions circling his mind. He'd called the county about the storage fees. The total was actually $14,000, not $12, with additional penalties accumulating monthly. The clerk had been sympathetic but clear pay or forfeit. No extensions, no payment plans. Sarah appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, settling into the lawn chair he kept for her occasional visits to his sanctuary. "I've been thinking about the plane," she said, and I think you should at least look at it properly before you decide anything. You've got a good eye for mechanical things. If there's salvage value, you'll see it." Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully. "Michael and Rebecca think I'm being foolish." "Michael and Rebecca have different priorities. They see problems where you sometimes see possibilities." She paused. "But Daniel, we can't afford to be wrong about this. If it's truly worthless, we walk away. We can't sacrifice our family's security for another one of your projects." Her words carried the weight of previous conversations about his tendency to see potential in forgotten things. Sometimes he'd been right. The 1967 Mustang he'd restored and sold for twice what he'd paid. Sometimes he'd been spectacularly wrong. The boat engine that consumed 6 months and $800 before he admitted defeat. "I'll take a proper look tomorrow," he promised. "If it's hopeless, I'll sign it over to the county." Sarah squeezed his shoulder as she rose to leave. "Just remember, some things are meant to stay buried. Your father kept that plane secret for 40 years. Maybe he had good reasons." Alone in his workshop, Daniel stared at the coffee growing cold in his hands. His father had been a mystery in life, distant, uncommunicative, present, but somehow absent from Daniel's childhood memories. The airplane felt like another riddle, another gap in understanding between father and son. But unlike their relationship, this mystery might actually yield answers. Outside, the Indiana night settled over Millbrook with the quiet that comes to small towns after business hours. Somewhere on the edge of town, past the defunct terminal building, a forgotten aircraft waited in its field of weeds and shadows. Tomorrow, Daniel would begin learning what secrets his father had left behind. Daniel arrived at the airfield before sunrise, driving through morning mist that clung to the abandoned runway like memories refusing to fade. He'd brought his toolkit, a thermos of coffee, and the stubborn determination that had sustained him through 20 years of coaxing life. From mechanical corpses, the Cessna looked even more forlorn in the early light. Dew had settled on its faded surfaces, making the metal gleam where rust hadn't claimed it. Daniel circled the aircraft slowly, noting details he'd missed in yesterday's cursory inspection. The landing gear, though sunk into soft earth, showed signs of quality maintenance before abandonment. Someone had cared for this machine, at least initially. He started with the exterior, checking control surfaces and looking for structural damage. The twin engines were seized, as expected, but the propellers moved when he applied pressure. The fuel tanks were empty, which was fortunate. 40-year-old aviation fuel would have created environmental hazards. The passenger door opened with protest, hinges groaning against years of disuse. Inside, Daniel found himself in a time capsule. The interior had been extensively modified from the standard Cessna configuration. Where civilian aircraft typically seated 4 passengers, this plane featured only 2 seats, facing a sophisticated communication console that belonged in a military aircraft, not a private plane. The pilot's seat was cracked leather, worn smooth by countless hours of use. On the floor beside it, wrapped in oiled canvas, Daniel discovered his first real surprise, a logbook that had somehow survived 4 decades of neglect. The leather cover was water-stained but intact. Inside, pages of flight records stretched from 1962 to 1967, then stopped abruptly. But these weren't ordinary pilot entries. The handwriting was his father's, but the destinations made no sense. Coordinates instead of airport codes, duration times that suggested flights beyond any civilian aircraft's normal range. And most puzzling of all, passenger manifests that listed only numbers, never names. Daniel sat in the pilot's seat, logbook open across his knees, trying to understand what he was reading. The entries were methodical, precise, but coded in a way that obscured their true purpose. Flight 847, departure 230 hours, coordinates 52.5 N, 13.4 E, cargo manifest classified, return 1,847 hours. Below it, in different ink, someone had written package delivered, authentication confirmed, subject relocated successfully. Making progress? Daniel spun around to find a man standing in the aircraft's doorway, tall, silver-haired, wearing a windbreaker that looked too expensive for Millbrook's casual atmosphere. The stranger's smile was friendly, but his eyes remained watchful. "Sorry to startle you," the man continued, stepping into the cabin uninvited. "I heard Robert Reeves had passed. Figured someone might finally be dealing with this old bird. And you are." "Marcus Webb. I knew your father, back in the day." He gestured toward the communication equipment. "Worked with him on some government contracts. When I heard about the inheritance, I thought I'd stop by, see if you might be interested in selling." Daniel closed the logbook carefully. "Selling? Well, let's be honest. It's not exactly flyable condition." Webb's gaze moved around the modified interior with familiarity that suggested previous visits. But there might be some historical value. Aircraft like this, with the modifications, collectors sometimes pay decent money for the components. Something in Webb's casual tone triggered Daniel's instincts. 20 years of dealing with customers had taught him to recognize when someone wanted something more than they were admitting. What kind of government contracts? Oh, this and that. Transportation services, mostly. Your father was a good pilot, very reliable. Webb's smile never wavered, but he'd deflected the question without answering it. The point is, I'd be willing to make you an offer. Save you the trouble of dealing with restoration or scrapping. Daniel stood, tucking the logbook under his arm. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready to make any decisions yet. Of course. Take your time. Webb produced a business card. But don't take too long. These old aircraft, they deteriorate quickly once you start poking around. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. After Webb left, Daniel spent another hour exploring the aircraft's interior. Behind the passenger seats, he discovered the first hidden compartment, a panel that appeared solid but shifted when he applied pressure in the right sequence. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were documents that made his hands shake as he read them. Aviation charts of Eastern Europe, marked with flight paths and timing notations. Photographs of airfields that didn't appear on any civilian maps. And most disturbing of all, a letter addressed to D. Reeves in his father's handwriting, dated just 2 years ago. The letter was brief. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've found what I couldn't bring myself to destroy. The plane was never about flying. It was about coming home. The real cargo is still hidden. Trust no one who knew me before 1968. The key is where you learn to work with your hands. Ah. Daniel read the letter 3 times before the implications settled in his mind. His father had known someone would eventually search the aircraft. He'd planned for this discovery, left clues that assumed Daniel would pursue the mystery. The phrase, "where you learn to work with your hands," could only mean one place: his father's workshop, in the garage, behind their childhood home. The same workspace where Robert had taught Daniel basic mechanical skills during the few periods when their relationship had approached normalcy. But the workshop had been cleaned out when Robert moved to his smaller house 10 years ago. Daniel remembered helping load tools into his father's truck, wondered what might have been left behind, deliberately hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How's it going? Remember, we have dinner with my parents tonight." Daniel typed back, "Found some interesting things. Will explain later." He spent the rest of the morning documenting everything he'd discovered, photographing pages from the logbook, mapping the locations of hidden compartments. The aircraft was revealing itself as something far more complex than abandoned transportation. By noon, he'd found 2 more concealed panels and enough evidence to confirm that this Cessna had been modified for purposes that had nothing to do with civilian aviation. The communication equipment alone was worth thousands of dollars, assuming it still functioned. But more importantly, every discovery reinforced his growing certainty that Robert Reeves had been far more than the simple construction worker his family had known. The drive back to town took him past the old family house, now occupied by a young couple with small children. Daniel slowed as he passed the detached garage, noting that the new owners had converted it into a playroom. The workshop, where he'd learned to hold a wrench, where his father had shown rare patience in teaching practical skills, was now filled with toys and bicycles. Sarah was waiting when he arrived home, her expression mixing curiosity with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." Daniel spread the photographs across their kitchen table. "Sarah, I think Dad was involved in something big." She studied the images of flight logs and mysterious documents. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. But that man who showed up today, Webb, he knew more than he was telling. And these flight logs, they're not normal civilian records." Sarah picked up one of the photographs, squinting at the handwritten coordinates. "Daniel, this is starting to feel dangerous. Maybe you should take Webb's offer and walk away." "I can't. Not yet." He showed her the letter from Robert. "He left this for me. He knew I'd find it, knew I'd have questions. Or maybe he knew you'd be stubborn enough to keep digging when smarter people would quit." That evening, over dinner with Sarah's parents, Daniel found himself distracted by thoughts of hidden compartments and coded flight logs. His father-in-law, a retired banker, noticed his preoccupation. "Sarah says you inherited an airplane. That's unusual." "More unusual than you might think," Daniel replied, earning a warning look from Sarah. Later, after they'd returned home and the kids were asleep, Sarah confronted him about his growing obsession. "Daniel, I need you to promise me something. If this gets dangerous, if these secrets your father kept turn out to be the kind that hurt people, you'll walk away." He wanted to promise, wanted to reassure her that he wouldn't risk their family's safety for his father's mysteries. But standing in their modest kitchen, holding documents that proved Robert Reeves had lived a double life, Daniel couldn't make that commitment. "I'll be careful," he said instead. Sarah's expression suggested she understood the difference between his promise and the one she'd requested. But she nodded anyway, because 20 years of marriage had taught her to recognize when her husband had committed himself to a path she couldn't redirect. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind turning over the day's discoveries. Somewhere in the darkness outside Millbrook, a modified aircraft waited with more secrets hidden in its modified frame. Tomorrow, he would continue searching. He would follow his father's cryptic clues toward whatever truth Robert Reeves had died protecting. The key is where you learn to work with your hands. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to remember every detail of his father's old workshop, every tool and workbench, every corner where a careful man might hide something he couldn't bear to destroy. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a Carnegie building that had seen better decades, its oak tables scarred by generations of students and its card catalogue replaced by a single computer terminal that wheezed when it connected to the internet. Daniel had never been much of a researcher, but the flight logs had given him specific dates to investigate. He started with newspaper archives, searching for any mention of his father between 1962 and 1967. The local paper yielded nothing. Robert Reeves might as well have been invisible during those years. But when Daniel expanded his search to regional papers, he found scattered references that made no sense. A 1964 article about a private aircraft making an emergency landing at Fort Wayne mentioned a pilot named R. Reeves. A 1965 piece about unusual air traffic patterns over Lake Michigan included a quote from an unnamed aviation expert who sounded remarkably like his father's careful way of speaking. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had known Daniel since childhood. She watched his research with growing curiosity. "Finding what you need, dear. I'm trying to learn about aviation in the 1960s. Private aircraft, government contracts, that sort of thing." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, we have some materials that aren't in the computer system yet. Local Historical Society donated boxes of documents last year. Haven't had time to catalogue everything." She led him to a back room where filing boxes sat stacked against water-stained walls. Military history, aviation records, government documents that got declassified. Help yourself, but put things back where you found them. Daniel spent 3 hours sifting through papers that chronicled the forgotten history of American aviation. Most were routine flight training records, aircraft registration changes, insurance claims from decades past. But in a box labeled Cold War-era miscellaneous, he discovered something that made his hands tremble. A 1963 memo from the Civil Aeronautics Administration addressed concerns about irregular flight patterns by private aircraft along the Canadian border. The memo specifically mentioned concerns about undocumented cargo and passenger transport by aircraft registered under civilian operators, but displaying characteristics consistent with government contract work. One of the aircraft registrations mentioned was in 7847C, the tail number painted on his father's Cessna. Daniel photographed the document with his phone, then continued searching. 20 minutes later, he found aviation charts of the Great Lakes region, marked with notations in familiar handwriting. His father's modifications weren't random. They followed specific routes, timed to coincide with weather patterns and air traffic schedules that would minimize observation. The workshop reference in Robert's letter had been nagging at Daniel since yesterday. The house had been sold, but the current owners might allow him to examine the garage. It was worth asking. The young couple who'd bought the family home were named Patterson. Daniel had never met them, but their children played in the same yard where he'd learned to ride a bicycle and caught fireflies on summer evenings. Mrs. Patterson answered his knock with a baby balanced on her hip and paint smudges on her fingers. "I know this is unusual," Daniel began, "but I inherited something from my father that included a reference to his old workshop. I was wondering if I could take a quick look in the garage." Mrs. Patterson's husband appeared behind her, sizing up Daniel with the protective instinct of a man who'd invested his savings in a house and neighborhood. "What kind of reference?" Patterson asked. Daniel chose his words carefully. "My father left some tools and equipment scattered around different places. He mentioned the workshop where he taught me mechanical work. I thought he might have left something there when you bought the house." The explanation wasn't entirely untrue, and the Pattersons seemed to accept it. They led him through the backyard, he remembered, past the oak tree where his childhood tire swing had once hung. The garage had been transformed into a playroom, but the basic structure remained unchanged. Daniel recognized the workbench his father had built, now supporting toy boxes and art supplies. The tool pegboard still hung on the far wall, painted bright yellow to match the room's cheerful atmosphere. "Take your time," Mrs. Patterson said. "The children are napping, so we won't disturb you." Daniel worked methodically, checking every corner, every shelf, every space where his father might have hidden something. The concrete floor had been painted since the sale, but Daniel remembered helping Robert pour that foundation when he was 12. They'd worked together in rare harmony, measuring and leveling, his father patient with his fumbling attempts to help. Behind the workbench, where the original electrical panel was mounted, Daniel found what he was looking for. The panel appeared normal, but when he pressed the metal housing in a specific sequence, the same pattern his father had used to open the aircraft's hidden compartment, a section shifted inward. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were aviation maps covering routes from the Great Lakes to the eastern seaboard. But these weren't the civilian charts available to any pilot. These were marked with restricted airspace, military installations, and notations that suggested intimate knowledge of border security procedures. More importantly, the maps were dated from different years, suggesting that Robert's mysterious activities had continued long after the flight logs ended. The most recent map was dated 1979, 16 years after Daniel had assumed his father's secret career had ended. A folded paper fell from between the maps. Daniel opened it to find another letter in his father's handwriting. "D, if you found the workshop cache, you're committed to understanding the truth. The aircraft was my insurance policy, but the real evidence is distributed across multiple locations. Each clue leads to the next, but only if you have the intelligence to interpret them correctly. The men I worked for believed in compartmentalized information. I adopted their methods for my own protection. Look for the places where we shared good memories. The truth is there, waiting for someone who knew me well enough to find it. Be careful who you trust. Some of the people I worked with are still alive, and they won't appreciate having their secrets disturbed." Daniel photographed the maps and letter, then carefully replaced everything in the hidden panel. His father had been methodical in his secrecy, creating a trail that only family could follow while protecting the evidence from casual discovery. As he prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson appeared with fresh coffee and the curiosity of a neighbor who'd noticed his intense focus. "Find what you were looking for?" "Some old tools that have sentimental value," Daniel replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thank you for letting me look. Your father was a quiet man, but he was always helpful when we had questions about the house. He knew every inch of this place." The comment reinforced Daniel's growing understanding of Robert's careful nature. His father had been a planner, someone who thought steps ahead and prepared for contingencies that might not arise for decades. Back home, Daniel spread the new maps across his kitchen table beside the aircraft documents. The pattern was becoming clearer. His father had been involved in transportation activities that required intimate knowledge of airspace restrictions, border security, and military installations. The dates suggested a career that spanned at least 17 years, far longer than the aircraft's flight logs indicated. Sarah found him there when she returned from grocery shopping, surrounded by documents that told the story of a man they'd never really known. "Daniel, this is getting complicated." "I know." He showed her the letter from the workshop. "But he left this trail deliberately. He wanted someone to find it. Maybe he wanted someone to destroy it. Maybe these are the kind of secrets that people take to their graves for good reasons." Daniel understood her concern, but the methodical nature of Robert's hidden messages suggested otherwise. These weren't the random paranoid preparations of a disturbed man. They were the careful arrangements of someone who'd lived with dangerous knowledge and wanted to ensure it wouldn't die with him. That evening, Marcus Webb called. "Daniel, I hope you've had time to consider my offer about the aircraft. I'd hate to see you get in over your head with restoration costs. I'm still evaluating the situation." "Of course. But I should mention, I've been asking around town about the plane. Seems like you've been doing some research yourself. Library visits, asking questions. That's exactly the kind of attention that might complicate things." The subtle threat in Webb's voice was unmistakable. Daniel felt his protective instincts sharpen. "Complicate things for whom?" "For everyone involved. Your father was a careful man, Daniel. He kept certain things private for good reasons. Some stones are better left unturned." After Webb hung up, Daniel sat in his workshop, staring at tools that had belonged to his father. He was beginning to understand that Robert's gift hadn't been an aircraft at all. It had been a choice, the opportunity to learn who his father really was, balanced against the safety of ignorance. Sarah appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression she wore when preparing for difficult conversations. "Daniel, I need you to think carefully about what you're doing. These aren't just family secrets anymore. That man Webb, he's threatening us. Not directly." "Close enough." She settled into her chair. "I've been thinking about your father's letter, about places where you shared good memories. Where else would he have hidden things?" Daniel had been considering the same question. His relationship with Robert had been distant, but there had been moments of connection. The fishing trips to Miller's Pond when Daniel was young. The afternoon they'd spent rebuilding the engine in Daniel's first car. The handful of times Robert had shown him how to repair things properly, with patience and precision. "Miller's Pond," Daniel said. "We used to fish there when I was a kid. He had a favorite spot near the old bridge." "Is it still accessible?" "Should be. It's part of the county park now." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then I think you need to look there. But Daniel, this has to be the last one. Whatever you find at the pond, that's where this ends. I won't have our family put at risk for secrets that died with your father." Daniel wanted to argue, to explain that understanding Robert's hidden life felt like a final chance to bridge the gap that had always existed between them. But looking at his wife's concerned face, he realized she was offering him a compromise, one last search, one final attempt to solve his father's riddle. "Agreed," he said. "Miller's Pond, and then we decide whether to keep going or walk away." Outside their small house, the Indiana night settled over Millbrook with its familiar quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, an abandoned aircraft waited with more secrets hidden in its modified frame. And somewhere else, if Daniel was reading his father's clues correctly, the next piece of the puzzle waited by the water, where a distant father and his son had once sat together in comfortable silence, fishing for trout and pretending that was enough. Miller's Pond at dawn looked exactly as Daniel remembered from childhood, a kidney-shaped body of water surrounded by cattails and old-growth trees, connected to Miller's Creek by a narrow channel that disappeared under the concrete bridge. He'd arrived early, before the park's joggers and dog walkers, wanting privacy for whatever he might discover. The old bridge was a simple concrete span, built sometime in the 1940s when the county had improved the access road. Daniel and his father had fished from its north side, where the water deepened and summer shade kept the trout comfortable. Standing there now, Daniel tried to recall every detail of those rare, peaceful mornings. Robert had been methodical even about fishing. He'd taught Daniel to tie knots properly, to read water currents, to remain patient when the fish weren't biting. More importantly, he'd talked during those fishing trips, actually talked about practical things like mechanical repair and the importance of precision in any craft worth doing well. "Look for the places where we shared good memories," his father's letter had said. This was the most obvious location, but finding something hidden here after 30 years seemed unlikely. The bridge was public property, visited by hundreds of people annually. Daniel walked the shoreline systematically, checking every tree that might conceal a cache, every rock formation large enough to hide something significant. After an hour, he'd found nothing but discarded fishing line and an old beer can someone had tossed into the cattails. But as he stood on the bridge, looking down at the water where he'd caught his first bass, Daniel remembered something specific. His father had always brought a tackle box that seemed unnecessarily large for their simple fishing expeditions. The box had contained the usual hooks and sinkers, but also items that hadn't made sense to a 10-year-old electronic devices, sealed containers, things that belonged in a laboratory rather than on a fishing trip. More significantly, Robert had sometimes walked away during their fishing sessions, taking that tackle box downstream to check the water temperature or look for better spots. These absences had lasted 15 or 20 minutes, long enough for a careful man to maintain hidden equipment or retrieve cached materials. Daniel followed the creek downstream from the bridge, moving carefully through brush that had grown thicker over the decades. About 300 yards from their usual fishing spot, he found what he was looking for, a concrete culvert that channeled the creek under a maintenance road. The structure was old, probably dating to the 1950s, and largely forgotten beneath layers of vegetation. Inside the culvert, protected from weather and casual observation, Daniel discovered a metal box secured with a combination lock. The box showed signs of regular maintenance despite its concealed location. Someone had been caring for it, keeping the lock mechanism clean and functional. The combination could be anything, but Daniel had learned to think like his father. He tried Robert's birthday, then his mother's, then his own. Nothing. Then he remembered his father's teaching about precision and consistency. Robert had used the same number sequence for multiple purposes: the hidden aircraft compartment, the workshop panel. The lock opened with a satisfying click. Inside, wrapped in waterproof material, Daniel found a collection of items that transformed his understanding of Robert's secret career. Radio frequencies written on index cards, each marked with specific dates and times. Photographs of men in civilian clothing who somehow projected military bearing. And most revealing of all, a small notebook filled with coded entries that matched the pattern from the aircraft's logbook. But the most significant discovery was a letter addressed to Elena Kozlov, dated just 3 months before Robert's death. The envelope was unsealed, as if Robert had been preparing to mail it but had reconsidered. Inside, Robert's familiar handwriting explained things Daniel had never imagined. "Elena, the symptoms are getting worse. Doctor says 6 months, maybe less. I need to know if the old agreements still hold. Daniel will find the evidence eventually. He's too stubborn to let mysteries go unsolved. If the remaining participants want to keep their secrets buried, they need to understand that my son will keep digging until he finds answers. He deserves to know who his father really was, but he also deserves to survive that knowledge. I've arranged things so the truth emerges gradually. By the time he finds this letter, he'll be committed to understanding, but he won't yet know enough to be in immediate danger. Contact him, explain what you can, help him understand the choices we made and why they still matter." Daniel read the letter twice, then checked the notebook more carefully. The coded entries weren't random, they followed a pattern based on radio frequencies and dates. His father had been maintaining communication with someone named Elena Kozlov. and the recent entries suggested that contact had continued until very shortly before Robert's death. A phone number was written on the letter's margin. Daniel stared at it for several minutes before deciding to call. The woman who answered spoke with a slight accent that suggested Eastern European origins. Her voice was cautious, professionally neutral. Elena Kozlov. Ms. Kozlov, this is Daniel Reeves. I think my father, Robert Reeves, was trying to contact you. A long pause. Daniel, I wondered when you would call. Your father said you would find the evidence eventually. You knew him well? We worked together for many years. I think it's time we met. Can you come to Fort Wayne? There's a diner called Mickey's on Calhoun Street. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Should I bring anything? Bring the questions you've been collecting. I'll bring some answers. After Elena hung up, Daniel sat in the culvert for another 20 minutes, processing what he'd learned. His father hadn't just been involved in mysterious activities, he'd been part of an ongoing operation that had continued until his death. The careful distribution of evidence wasn't random. Robert had been preparing for this moment, arranging for Daniel to discover the truth in a sequence that would maximize understanding while minimizing danger. The drive back to Millbrook gave Daniel time to consider how much he should tell Sarah. The conversation with Elena Kozlov had elevated the situation beyond family secrets. These were professional arrangements, maintained by people who understood operational security. He found Sarah in their kitchen, grading papers from her part-time bookkeeping job. She looked up when he entered, reading his expression with the precision of 20 years of marriage. You found something? Daniel showed her the photographs and notebook, but kept Elena's letter folded in his pocket. There's someone I need to meet tomorrow, someone who worked with Dad. Daniel, this is exactly what I was afraid of. You're getting drawn into something bigger than you can handle. I know, but I've already called her. Meeting tomorrow afternoon. Sarah set down her pen and studied his face. Her, Elena Kozlov. She knew Dad was sick, knew he'd arranged for me to find the evidence. She's been expecting my call. And you trust her? Daniel considered the question carefully. I don't know her well enough to trust or distrust her, but she knew things about Dad that no one else seems to know. If I want answers, she might be my only source. That evening, Marcus Webb called again. His tone had shifted from friendly persuasion to barely concealed irritation. Daniel, I'm hearing you've been asking questions around town, making phone calls. That's the kind of activity that attracts unwanted attention. What kind of attention? The kind that makes simple problems complicated. Look, I'll double my previous offer. Cash, tomorrow, no questions asked. Take the money and walk away from whatever you think you've found. And if I don't, then you might discover that some family legacies are more burden than blessing. After Webb hung up, Daniel realized he was now dealing with at least 3 different interested parties. Elena Kozlov, who'd worked with his father, Marcus Webb, who wanted the secrets buried, and whatever other people might be watching his investigation with concerns he couldn't yet understand. Sarah found him in his workshop later that evening, staring at tools without really seeing them. Second thoughts about tomorrow's meeting. No. But I'm starting to understand why Dad kept these secrets. The more I learn, the more complicated it becomes. Daniel, I need you to promise me something. If this Elena person tells you things that put our family at risk, you'll walk away. I don't care what secrets your father kept or why he kept them. Our children's safety comes first. Daniel wanted to promise, but the methodical nature of Robert's preparations suggested that walking away might not be possible. His father had created a trail that led from one discovery to the next, each revelation making it harder to retreat. Whether Robert had intended to protect Daniel or trap him remained unclear. I'll be careful, he said, which wasn't the promise Sarah wanted, but was the only commitment he could make honestly. That night, Daniel lay awake, thinking about the radio frequencies and coded notebook entries. His father had been part of something organized, something that required regular communication and careful operational security. The question wasn't whether Robert had been involved in government work, the evidence made that clear. The question was whether that work had ended with the Cold War, or whether Daniel was about to discover that some operations never really end. In the morning, he would drive to Fort Wayne and meet a woman who'd known his father better than his own family had. She would tell him things that would either explain Robert's lifetime of secrets or complicate them beyond Daniel's ability to understand. Either way, by tomorrow evening, Daniel would know more about his father's hidden life than he'd learned in 42 years of being Robert's son. Whether that knowledge would bring peace or danger remained to be seen. Mickey's Diner occupied a converted railroad car on Calhoun Street, the kind of establishment that served coffee in heavy white mugs and attracted customers who valued substance over atmosphere. Daniel arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a booth with clear sight lines to both entrances, a precaution that would have amused him a week ago, but now seemed prudent. Elena Kozlov entered precisely at 2 o'clock. She was smaller than her voice had suggested, perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical style and intelligent eyes that surveyed the diner with professional assessment before settling on Daniel. She wore a simple grey coat and carried herself with the controlled posture of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "You look like your father," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Same stubborn expression he wore when he'd decided something needed fixing. "Ms. Kozlov." "Elena, we're going to discuss family matters after a fashion." She ordered coffee from the waitress, then studied Daniel with unsettling directness. "Your father said you were intelligent but impractical. He worried that you'd inherited his sense of responsibility without developing his caution. He talked about me? Frequently, especially in recent years. Robert felt guilty about the distance between you, but he believed it was necessary protection." Elena's coffee arrived, and she wrapped her hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from it. "Tell me what you've found so far." Daniel described his discoveries methodically, the aircraft's hidden compartments, the coded flight logs, the maps in his father's workshop, the radio frequencies and notebook from Miller's Pond. Elena listened without interruption, her expression revealing neither surprise nor concern. "You've been thorough," she said when he finished. "Robert predicted you would be. He said you approached mechanical problems the same way he approached operational planning, systematically, persistently, refusing to accept incomplete solutions." "What kind of operations?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel as if evaluating his capacity for dangerous truths. "Your father was a CIA asset from 1962 until 1979. Not an employee. He maintained his civilian identity and construction job, but a contracted pilot who provided transportation services for sensitive operations. The aircraft you inherited was his primary operational tool." The confirmation hit Daniel like cold water, despite his growing suspicions. "What kind of transportation?" During the Cold War, intelligence services needed ways to move people and materials without official acknowledgement. Private aircraft, properly modified and operated by reliable pilots, provided that capability. "Your father specialized in cross-border operations, extracting assets from Soviet-controlled territories, delivering equipment to resistance groups, transporting defectors to safe locations." Daniel thought about the flight logs, with their cryptic coordinates and passenger manifests. The numbers in his logbook, those were people. Asset identification codes. Your father transported 47 people to freedom over 17 years. Scientists, military officers, political dissidents, anyone whose knowledge or testimony was valuable to Western intelligence services. Elena's voice carried professional pride. "He never lost anyone, not once." The weight of Robert's hidden heroism settled over Daniel like a revelation. His distant, uncommunicative father had been saving lives while maintaining a cover identity as an ordinary construction worker. Why did he stop in 1979? Elena's expression darkened. Operation Falcon, The mission that ended his operational career and created the problems you're now inheriting. I found that name in his documents. Your father volunteered for one final operation, recovering assets that Nazi war criminals had hidden in Swiss banks. The operation was successful. We recovered documentation proving that several prominent American businessmen had collaborated with Nazi financial networks. We also recovered approximately $219 million in assets that rightfully belonged to Holocaust survivors and their families. Daniel felt pieces of the puzzle shifting into place. The money went missing. The money was stolen by the CIA officials who organized Operation Falcon. They intended to distribute it among themselves rather than return it to its rightful owners. Your father discovered the theft and refused to participate. So he kept the evidence. He kept everything. Documentation proving the Nazi connections, bank records showing the theft, correspondence between the corrupt officials. He also kept the access codes for the Swiss accounts where the money was deposited. Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your father spent the last 40 years of his life protecting that evidence and planning for its eventual revelation. Daniel stared at her, understanding finally dawning. The Swiss bank key, Elena nodded. Hidden in the aircraft's instrument panel, if he followed the plan we discussed. The key unlocks more than just the account. It provides access to safety deposit boxes containing complete documentation of Operation Falcon and the subsequent theft. Why didn't he expose this himself? Because the people who stole that money are still alive, still powerful. 3 of them hold significant positions in current intelligence services. They've spent decades ensuring that Operation Falcon remains classified and that anyone with knowledge of their theft stays silent. Daniel thought about Marcus Webb's increasingly threatening phone calls. Webb works for them. Marcus Webb was Robert's handler during the early operations. When your father refused to participate in the theft, Webb became his warden, tasked with ensuring Robert's silence. Webb has been watching your father for 40 years, waiting for any sign that the secret might emerge. The diner seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the weight of these revelations had somehow muffled the normal sounds of afternoon traffic and casual conversation. Daniel found himself looking toward the windows, wondering if Webb's surveillance had followed him to Fort Wayne. Elena noticed his concern. We're safe here. I chose this location carefully. But Daniel, you need to understand something. By continuing your investigation, you've made yourself a target. Webb's employers won't tolerate the possibility of exposure. What do they want? They want the evidence destroyed and anyone with knowledge of it eliminated. They've remained safe for 40 years because your father was careful and disciplined. You're neither careful nor disciplined, which makes you dangerous to them. Daniel felt anger building not just at the corrupt officials Elena described, but at his father's lifetime of silence. Why didn't he tell me? Why let me stumble into this blindly? Because he hoped you wouldn't. He arranged the evidence trail as insurance, not as an invitation. If you'd been content to sell the aircraft for scrap, the secrets would have died with him. By investigating, you proved you needed to know the truth. And now? Elena reached into her purse and withdrew a small metal object, a key identical to the one Daniel had found in the aircraft. Your father gave me this 20 years ago, when he realized his age and health might prevent him from completing the mission himself. It opens a safety deposit box in Chicago, containing backup copies of everything. She placed the key on the table between them. You have a choice, Daniel. You can take this key and complete your father's work, expose the corruption, return the stolen money to its rightful recipients, ensure that the victims of Operation Falcon receive justice. Or you can walk away, sell the aircraft to Webb's people, and let the past stay buried. Daniel stared at the key, understanding that touching it would commit him to a path he couldn't retreat from. What happens if I choose justice? You'll face professional killers with 40 years of experience in keeping secrets buried. You'll risk your family's safety for the sake of people you've never met. You'll discover that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you ever imagined. And if I walk away, Webb's employers will sleep easier, your father's work will remain unfinished, and $219 million in stolen assets will remain in the hands of people who enrich themselves through collaboration with war criminals. The choice was brutal in its simplicity, but Elena's presentation felt incomplete. Daniel sensed she was holding something back. There's more, isn't there? Something you haven't told me. Elena smiled for the first time since entering the diner. Your father said you were perceptive. Yes, there's more. The corrupt officials aren't the only interested parties. I represent a group of intelligence veterans who've been working quietly for decades to address Cold War injustices. We have resources, experience, and most importantly, we have a plan. What kind of plan? Your father's evidence, properly revealed, would expose not just the Operation Falcon theft, but a pattern of corruption that continued long after the Cold War ended. The story would trigger congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, and most importantly, the return of stolen assets to Holocaust survivors and their families. Elena leaned back in her seat. We're not asking you to face Webb's people alone, Daniel. We're offering you the chance to finish your father's work with support from people who understand the risks and know how to manage them. Daniel picked up the key, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small object to carry such enormous consequences. If I do this, what happens to my family? We protect them, relocation if necessary, new identities if the situation demands it. Your father made those arrangements a condition of any future operation. He planned for this conversation. He planned for every contingency he could imagine. Robert Reeves was many things, but he was never unprepared. Daniel thought about Sarah's concerns, about his children's safety, about the simple life he'd built in Millbrook. Then he thought about the people his father had saved, the justice that had been denied for 40 years, the choice between comfortable ignorance and dangerous truth. How long do I have to decide? Webb's people are already moving. They broke into your house yesterday while you were here. They found copies of the documents you photographed, but couldn't locate the originals. They know you're close to understanding everything. The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. They were in my house. Your wife and children were at school and work. No one was hurt. But Daniel, the grace period is over. Webb's employers have decided you know too much to remain free. The only question now is whether you'll face them with our support or alone. Daniel closed his fist around the key, feeling its edges press into his palm. His father had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, arranging pieces on a board that stretched across decades. Now the game was ending, and Daniel had to choose which side he wanted to win. Outside Mickey's diner, Fort Wayne continued its normal afternoon rhythm, traffic lights changing, people hurrying to appointments, and life proceeding with the comfortable predictability that Daniel realized he was about to abandon forever. What's the first step? He asked. Elena's smile was both satisfied and sympathetic. Now you learn what your father really did for 17 years and why the truth was worth protecting with his life. The drive back to Millbrook felt like traveling through a world that had shifted while Daniel wasn't watching. Every car in his rearview mirror might contain surveillance. Every phone call might be monitored. Every decision might have consequences extending far beyond his understanding. Elena had given him a secure phone and instructions to call only from public locations, using code phrases that felt like dialogue from spy movies. But first, he had to face Sarah. She was waiting in their living room when he arrived, surrounded by evidence of the break-in he hadn't known had occurred. Drawers had been searched and carefully restored to approximate order, papers shuffled through and restacked, personal items examined and replaced. The violation was subtle but thorough, the work of professionals who wanted to learn without revealing their presence. They were very neat about it, Sarah said without looking up from the insurance papers she was reviewing. If I hadn't noticed my jewelry box was positioned differently, I might never have known. Daniel sat beside her on the couch they'd bought second-hand 12 years ago, in the living room where they'd raised their children and planned their modest dreams. The domestic normalcy felt surreal after his conversation with Elena. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" "Because I think part of you is excited about this. Finally, a mystery worthy of your attention. Finally, secrets that make your father interesting instead of just distant." Her words stung because they contained truth he didn't want to acknowledge. "Sarah, it's more complicated than that." "Then explain it to me. Make me understand why strangers are searching our house and threatening our family because of something your father did 40 years ago." Daniel told her everything: Elena's revelations about Robert's CIA work, Operation Falcon, the stolen Nazi gold, the corrupt officials who'd been protecting their secret for decades. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. $219 million, she said when he finished. "That belongs to Holocaust survivors and their families. And you believe this Elena person? You trust someone who admits to being part of whatever secretive organization your father worked for?" The question forced Daniel to confront his own motivations. Did he trust Elena, or did he simply want to believe that Robert's lifetime of distance had served a noble purpose? "I trust the evidence. The documents, the aircraft modifications, the systematic way Dad arranged for me to find everything. This isn't random paranoia, it's careful planning by someone who knew dangerous people were watching him." Sarah stood and walked to the window, overlooking their small backyard. "Daniel, even if everything Elena told you is true, what makes you think you can succeed where your father spent 40 years being careful?" "Because I'm not alone. Elena's organization has resources, experience. They've been working on this for decades. And they need you because I have legal access to Dad's evidence. Because his arrangements require family participation. Because—" Daniel paused, realizing the truth as he spoke it. "Because they've been waiting for him to die so they could finally act." Sarah turned from the window, her expression mixing anger with resignation. "So, your father's death wasn't the end of his secret career. It was the beginning of yours." Before Daniel could respond, the secure phone Elena had given him buzzed with a text message. "Package delivered to Miller's Pond. Retrieve within 2 hours. Come alone. Daniel showed the message to Sarah. "She's left something at the pond." "Don't go." "Sarah, don't go, Daniel. Call her back and tell her you've changed your mind. Tell her you choose your family over secrets you can't understand." Daniel wanted to promise he'd stay home, wanted to choose the safety of ignorance over the danger of knowledge. But the systematic nature of Robert's preparations suggested that retreat might not be possible. His father had created a sequence of discoveries, each one making it harder to abandon the truth. What if walking away isn't an option anymore? What if they consider me a threat, regardless of what I choose? Sarah's silence was answer enough. She understood, as he was beginning to understand, that some secrets don't allow witnesses to remain neutral. The secure phone buzzed again. "Webb's team moving tonight. Retrieve package now or lose opportunity permanently." Daniel kissed Sarah gently, tasting tears he hadn't noticed falling. "Lock the doors. Don't answer the phone. If I'm not back in 2 hours, take the kids and go to your sister's house in Indianapolis. Daniel, I love you. Remember that, whatever happens next." Miller's Pond looked different in late afternoon light, shadows stretching across water that reflected the golden October sky. Daniel found Elena's package exactly where he'd discovered his father's cache that morning, inside the concrete culvert, protected from weather and observation. The package contained items that transformed his understanding of the situation's urgency. Photographs of men in expensive suits, identified by handwritten captions as the surviving Operation Falcon participants. Current addresses, daily schedules, security arrangements. A plan for coordinating their simultaneous exposure through multiple media outlets. But most importantly, the package contained a letter written in Robert's handwriting, dated just 1 month before his death. "Daniel, if you're reading this, Elena has decided you're ready for the final phase. The evidence you've found so far proves the theft occurred, but it doesn't provide access to the stolen funds. The real key, the one that opens the Swiss accounts, is hidden in the aircraft's tail section, behind the emergency locator transmitter. But Daniel, retrieving that key will trigger electronic alarms that have been monitored for 40 years. The moment you remove it, Webb's employers will know their secret is about to be exposed. You'll have perhaps 12 hours to complete the mission before they locate and eliminate everyone involved. Elena's plan is sound, but the risks are absolute. Choose carefully. Your children deserve a father more than the world deserves justice. But if you choose justice, know that your father is proud of the man you've become. Daniel read the letter twice, then noticed a second document, a complete operational plan, detailing how to access the Swiss accounts, retrieve the documentation, and coordinate media exposure across multiple countries simultaneously. Elena's organization had spent years preparing for this moment. His secure phone rang. Elena's voice was tense with urgency. "Daniel, Webb's team is mobilizing. We have intelligence indicating they'll move against you and your family within hours. The window for controlled action is closing. What happens if I get the key?" "We execute the plan immediately. Full exposure, complete documentation release, coordinated arrests of the corrupt officials. But Daniel, once you remove that key, there's no retreat. We either succeed completely or we all disappear." Daniel thought about Sarah's tears, about his children's trust, about the simple life he was about to sacrifice for the sake of people he'd never meet. "How long do I have to decide?" "You don't. Webb's vehicles are 15 minutes from your location. If you're going to act, it has to be now." Daniel could hear engines in the distance, growing closer. His father's final gift wasn't just the key to stolen Nazi gold. It was the choice between safety and justice, between family and duty, between the comfortable ignorance he'd lived with for 42 years and the dangerous truth Robert had died protecting. In the fading October light, beside the water where his father had taught him patience and precision, Daniel Reeves made the choice that would determine whether Robert's 40-year mission would end in success or tragedy. He started running toward the abandoned airfield, Elena's operational plan clutched in his hand, the sound of approaching vehicles growing louder behind him. Daniel reached the airfield as the first black SUV turned onto the access road. The abandoned terminal building provided temporary cover, but Webb's team would search systematically, and the aircraft offered no real concealment. He had minutes at most to locate the key his father had described. The Cessna's tail section required partial disassembly to access the emergency locator transmitter. Daniel worked with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that precision mattered more than speed. His mechanical training served him well. He'd dismantled similar systems dozens of times during his career as a mechanic. Behind the transmitter unit, exactly where Robert had promised, Daniel found a small metal cylinder wrapped in waterproof material. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was an electronic device that looked more like a sophisticated calculator than a traditional key. Numbers scrolled across its small display account codes, access protocols, authentication sequences that would unlock 40 years of hidden evidence. The moment he removed the cylinder, Daniel heard an electronic tone emanating from somewhere else in the aircraft. His father's warning had been accurate. Removing the key had triggered monitoring systems that Webb's employers had maintained for 4 decades. "Daniel Reeves." Webb's voice carried clearly across the airfield. "Step away from the aircraft. This doesn't have to end badly." Daniel remained hidden in the aircraft's interior, trying to contact Elena on the secure phone. No answer. Either she was implementing the operational plan, or Webb's team had already eliminated her. "Your father was a stubborn man," Webb continued, his voice moving closer. "He spent 40 years protecting secrets that should have stayed buried. Don't make his mistake." Daniel activated the electronic key according to Elena's instructions. The device connected to satellite networks, transmitting authentication codes to Swiss banking systems. Somewhere in Geneva, safety deposit boxes were unlocking, releasing documentation that would expose decades of corruption. But as the transmission completed, Daniel discovered Elena's final deception. A message appeared on the device's screen. Transfer complete. Account balance 219,847, 0. Transferred to D. Reeves' personal account, First National Bank of Geneva. Transaction irreversible. Daniel stared at the display in shock. Elena hadn't been planning to return the stolen money to Holocaust survivors. She'd been planning to steal it herself, using Daniel's legal access to his father's evidence as cover for the ultimate theft. His secure phone buzzed with a text message. "Thank you for your assistance. The funds will be distributed to appropriate recipients through our organization. Your family's safety is assured as long as you remain silent about tonight's events. E." The betrayal hit Daniel like a physical blow. Elena's organization wasn't composed of justice-seeking intelligence veterans. They were thieves who'd been waiting 40 years for access to Robert's evidence, using Daniel's emotional need to understand his father as leverage for their own enrichment. But as Daniel processed Elena's deception, he realized she'd made a crucial error. The electronic key contained more than just banking access codes. It held complete copies of all the documents Robert had collected. Elena's theft had also triggered the release of evidence that would expose not just Webb's corrupt officials, but Elena's organization as well. "Daniel, you have 10 seconds to exit that aircraft before we come in after you." Webb's patience was exhausting. "Your father's heroic self-image was a delusion. Operation Falcon was never about justice, it was about money. Robert stole those funds and spent 40 years planning to enrich his family through their eventual recovery." Webb's revelation competed with Elena's betrayal for Daniel's attention. Everyone had been lying his father about his motivations, Elena about her organization's intentions, Webb about the nature of the original crime. Daniel activated the device's secondary function, following instructions Robert had included in his final letter. The key began broadcasting on multiple frequencies simultaneously, transmitting complete documentation to news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and government oversight committees across 3 countries. Whatever the truth about Operation Falcon, whatever Robert's real motivations, the evidence would now be evaluated by people with no personal stake in keeping secrets buried. Webb appeared in the aircraft's doorway, his professional composure replaced by desperate urgency. "What did you just do?" "I finished my father's work." "Your father's work was theft, Daniel. He stole that money and convinced himself he was protecting it. Elena Kozlov is a former Soviet intelligence officer who's been planning this theft for decades. You've been used by everyone involved." Webb's explanation felt true in ways that Elena's heroic narrative hadn't. Daniel's father had been many things, but he'd never been particularly idealistic. The careful, methodical way Robert had arranged, the evidence suggested planning for personal benefit, not altruistic justice. Then why did you spend 40 years watching him instead of simply taking the evidence? "Because we needed him alive to access the Swiss accounts. The banking protocols required biometric authentication from the original account holder. We've been waiting for him to die naturally and leave the access codes to family members we could manipulate." Daniel understood, with horrifying clarity, that everyone, Elena's organization, Webb's employers, even his own father, had viewed him as a means to an end. His emotional need to understand Robert's hidden life had made him the perfect tool for competing groups of thieves. But Robert's final preparations had anticipated this possibility. The electronic key's broadcasting function ensured that regardless of who ultimately controlled the money, the truth about Operation Falcon would become public knowledge. "The transmission is complete," Daniel said. "Every news organization in 3 countries now has complete documentation about the original theft, your 40-year cover-up, and Elena's organization's current theft. Whatever happens to me, the story will be published." Webb's expression shifted from urgency to resignation. Your father was more paranoid than we realized. My father was a careful man who didn't trust anyone completely, including me. The sound of additional vehicles arriving at the airfield interrupted their conversation. Through the aircraft's windows, Daniel could see official sedans and unmarked law enforcement vehicles surrounding the area. Either Elena's plan had triggered government response, or Webb's employers had decided to contain the situation through official channels. Elena Kozlov emerged from one of the sedans, but she wasn't alone. Federal agents flanked her, their presence suggesting that her organization's theft had been anticipated by law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring the situation for years. "Daniel," Elena called across the airfield, "the operation has been completed successfully. The funds are being transferred to the appropriate recipients as planned." But Daniel could see the truth in the agents' positioning, in the way they maintained control over Elena's movements. Her organization had been under surveillance, their theft attempt anticipated and countered by agencies with longer planning horizons than any of the immediate participants had realized. Webb lowered his weapon, his professional resignation complete. 40 years of careful security, destroyed by one man's need to be a hero to his son. Daniel climbed out of the aircraft, still holding the electronic key that had triggered events beyond anyone's complete control. Around the airfield, federal agents were establishing a perimeter that would ensure no one left without extensive debriefing. As the sun set over the abandoned runway where his father's final secret had been revealed, Daniel realized that Robert's true legacy wasn't the money or the evidence or even the truth about Operation Falcon. It was the choice between different types of corruption, different kinds of theft, different versions of justice that all served someone's personal interests. The only certainty was that by morning, Daniel's quiet life in Millbrook would be over forever, replaced by whatever consequences emerged from 40 years of carefully maintained lies, finally colliding with each other in ways no one had completely anticipated. But for the first time since inheriting his father's mysterious aircraft, Daniel felt like he finally understood Robert Reeves not as a hero or a thief, but as a man who'd spent 4 decades trying to choose the least harmful option among competing evils, and who'd arranged for his son to make the final choice when all other options had been exhausted. The federal safe house in Indianapolis looked like countless suburban homes, beige siding, modest landscaping, the kind of deliberate normalcy that would never attract attention. Daniel had been there for 6 days, debriefed by agents whose names changed daily and whose questions revealed the scope of an investigation that stretched back decades. Sarah and the children had been relocated to a similar facility in Cincinnati. They were safe, but Daniel hadn't been allowed contact beyond brief, monitored phone calls that confirmed their well-being without providing comfort. The separation felt like punishment for choices he'd made with incomplete information. Agent Rebecca Martinez had been assigned as his primary handler, a woman in her 40s whose patient professionalism suggested extensive experience with reluctant witnesses caught in situations beyond their understanding. She entered the safe house kitchen, where Daniel sat reviewing transcripts of his previous debriefings, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd triggered. "The Swiss Banking Commission released their preliminary findings," Martinez said, settling into the chair across from him. "Your father's electronic key didn't just access the Operation Falcon accounts. It triggered the release of banking records dating back to 1945. Daniel looked up from the transcripts. "How much money?" "The Nazi gold your father helped recover was only part of a larger network. Swiss banks had been holding assets stolen from Holocaust victims for decades, waiting for legal heirs who were never contacted about their inheritance. The total value, adjusted for compound interest over 75 years, exceeds $800 million. The number was so large Daniel had trouble processing it. And Elena's organization? They were Soviet sleeper agents who'd been monitoring the situation since the 1960s. Elena Kozlov was her real name, but she'd been working for Russian intelligence services since before the Cold War ended. Her plan was to steal the money and use it to fund current operations against American interests. Daniel thought about Elena's convincing portrayal of a justice-seeking intelligence veteran. How long had they been planning this? Since your father first refused to participate in the original theft. Elena's handlers realized that eventually the evidence would pass to family members who could be manipulated. They've been waiting 40 years for the right opportunity. Martinez spread additional documents across the kitchen table: photographs, surveillance reports, communication intercepts that revealed the scope of foreign intelligence interest in Robert's hidden evidence. Your father knew about the Russian surveillance? He suspected it. The methodical way he distributed the evidence, the careful timing of its release, the electronic countermeasures built into the key, all of it suggests he understood that multiple hostile parties were monitoring the situation. Daniel studied photographs of Elena, taken over several decades, documenting her patient infiltration of intelligence veteran communities. Her entire identity as a justice-seeking former CIA asset had been carefully constructed to gain access to Operation Falcon survivors. What happens now? Martinez's expression grew more serious. That depends on choices you haven't made yet. The evidence your father collected doesn't just expose the Operation Falcon theft. It documents a pattern of corruption that continued into current intelligence operations. Some very powerful people are going to prison, but others are negotiating for reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. She produced a thick folder marked with security classifications Daniel didn't recognize. Marcus Webb has provided extensive testimony about the cover-up operations he coordinated over 4 decades. His information will help us identify and prosecute the remaining participants, but only if you're willing to testify about your father's evidence and its contents. Daniel opened the folder, finding detailed accounts of surveillance operations, witness intimidation, and evidence suppression that had continued for decades after the original theft. Webb's confession revealed the scope of resources devoted to keeping Operation Falcon secret. Why is my testimony necessary? You have all the evidence. Because the courts will require testimony from the person who legally inherited and activated your father's evidence. Your role as the inheriting son provides legal standing that makes the evidence admissible. Without your testimony, much of what we've recovered might be excluded from prosecution. Daniel understood the irony. His father's careful legal arrangements hadn't just been about protecting the evidence, they'd been about ensuring that its eventual revelation would be legally sound, admissible in court, and powerful enough to support criminal prosecutions. And if I refuse to testify, the prosecutions proceed with whatever evidence remains admissible, but the chances of successful convictions drop significantly. The corrupt officials your father spent 40 years opposing would likely escape justice. Martinez leaned back in her chair, studying Daniel with the assessment of someone who'd seen witnesses make similar choices. But Daniel, testifying means your family's anonymity ends permanently. The trials will be public, your identity will be revealed, and you'll spend the rest of your life as the son of a Cold War hero who exposed government corruption. Some people will consider you a patriot. Others will consider you a traitor. Daniel thought about his children, about the normal childhood he'd wanted to provide them, about the simple life in Millbrook that had been destroyed by his decision to investigate his father's secrets. How long would the trials last? 2 years, minimum. Multiple jurisdictions, numerous defendants, extensive evidence review. Your family would remain in protective custody throughout the process. And afterward? Witness protection, if you choose it. New identities, relocation assistance, ongoing security monitoring. Or you can return to normal life with enhanced security measures and the knowledge that some very dangerous people have reasons to resent your testimony. Daniel stood and walked to the kitchen window, overlooking the safe house's carefully maintained backyard. 6 days ago, he'd been a small-town mechanic whose biggest concern was paying storage fees for a rusted aircraft. Now he was being asked to sacrifice his family's anonymity for the sake of prosecuting crimes he'd never known existed. "Can I see the complete evidence files? Everything my father collected, everything Webb has provided, everything Elena's organization was trying to steal." Martinez nodded. "The complete files are classified, but given your role in the case, you have clearance to review everything. Fair warning, it's extensive. Your father documented 40 years of corruption with obsessive thoroughness." That afternoon, Daniel began reading through the complete Operation Falcon files. What he discovered was more complex than anyone had suggested. Robert hadn't just been a CIA asset who'd refused to participate in theft. He'd been systematically documenting corruption across multiple intelligence agencies, building a case that would expose institutional problems rather than individual crimes. The Swiss bank accounts hadn't just contained stolen Nazi gold. They'd held evidence of ongoing money laundering operations that continued into the present day. Robert's evidence would expose not just historical crimes, but current criminal enterprises operated by intelligence officials who'd used their government positions for personal enrichment. Most importantly, Daniel discovered that his father's arrangements hadn't been motivated primarily by justice or greed. Robert had been dying of cancer, as Elena had mentioned, but he'd also been aware that his evidence was the only leverage protecting Daniel's family from retaliation by people who'd spent decades suppressing the truth. A letter Daniel hadn't seen before, hidden in the deepest layers of the classified files, explained Robert's real motivations. "Daniel, if you're reading this, the evidence has been fully revealed, and you're being asked to make choices about prosecution and testimony. The people involved in Operation Falcon aren't just thieves, they're part of ongoing criminal enterprises that will continue harming innocents as long as they remain unexposed. But son, your family's safety matters more than abstract justice. If testifying puts Sarah and the children at risk, walk away. The world has survived 40 years without this truth being revealed. It can survive longer if necessary. You don't owe the world your family's security. Choose them, always. Dad." For the first time in his adult life, Daniel read words from his father that expressed unconditional love and protection. Robert's lifetime of emotional distance had been motivated not by indifference, but by the understanding that his dangerous knowledge made closeness a liability for the people he cared about most. That evening, Martinez found Daniel in the safe house living room, staring at family photographs Sarah had been allowed to send. "Have you decided about testifying?" Daniel looked at pictures of Tommy and Lisa, normal teenagers whose lives had been disrupted by secrets their grandfather had carried for 4 decades. "I want to talk to Sarah first. Whatever I decide affects all of us." Martinez nodded. "I can arrange a secure video call." "But Daniel, the prosecution needs your decision soon. Some of the defendants are negotiating plea agreements that depend on whether your testimony will be available." "How much time do I have?" 48 hours. After that, the prosecutors will have to proceed with the evidence they can use without your involvement." Daniel understood that his father's final gift wasn't the aircraft or the evidence or even the truth about Operation Falcon. It was the choice between justice and family, between exposing corruption and protecting the people he loved, between finishing Robert's work and choosing a different path entirely. By Friday morning, Daniel would have to decide whether Robert Reeves' 40-year mission would end in triumph or in the quiet safety of continued secrecy. Either choice would change his family's future forever, but in very different ways. Outside the safe house windows, Indianapolis continued its normal rhythm. People going to work, children playing in yards, life proceeding with the comfortable predictability that Daniel realized he might never experience again, regardless of what he chose. The secure video call connected at precisely 9 a.m. on Thursday morning. Sarah's face appeared on the screen, thinner than Daniel remembered, her eyes showing the strain of a week in protective custody with two confused teenagers who deserved explanations she couldn't provide. "You look tired," she said, which was her way of expressing concern without admitting fear. "I've been reading files, learning things about Dad that I never imagined." Daniel studied her face, noting the careful way she positioned herself in front of the camera to hide the institutional furniture of her safe house location. "Sarah, the choice they're asking me to make, it's not just about testifying in some courtroom. It's about whether we spend the rest of our lives being the family that exposed government corruption. And if you refuse, the prosecutions still proceed, but with reduced chances of success. Some very dangerous people continue operating with immunity. The money your father protected stays in limbo, and the Holocaust survivors who should inherit it continue being denied justice." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended far beyond their personal situation. "Daniel, can you live with that choice? Can you walk away knowing you had the power to stop ongoing crimes but chose family safety instead?" The question cut to the heart of Daniel's internal struggle. His father had spent 40 years carrying the burden of delayed justice. Now that burden was being transferred to Daniel, with the added weight of knowing that his choice would determine whether Robert's sacrifice had meaning. "Can you live with the alternative?" Daniel asked. "Years of trials, death threats, witness protection, the kids growing up knowing their grandfather was a spy and their father was the man who exposed his secrets? I don't know. But Daniel, I keep thinking about something you said, that your father saved 47 people during his operational career. 47 families who got to live free lives because one man was willing to risk everything for strangers." Through the screen, Daniel could see Sarah making the same calculation he'd been struggling with for days. The choice wasn't really between safety and danger. Both paths carried risks. The choice was between different types of responsibility, different kinds of legacy they'd leave for their children. "The agent handling my case says the corruption continues into current operations. It's not just historical crimes. People are being hurt right now by the same networks your father tried to stop." Sarah looked directly into the camera. "Then I think you already know what your father would want you to do, and I think you know what kind of man you want to be for Tommy and Lisa." Before Daniel could respond, Agent Martinez entered the safe house's communication room. Her expression was urgent in a way that immediately shifted the conversation's tone. "Daniel, we have a problem. 3 of the Operation Falcon defendants have disappeared from federal custody. They were being transported between facilities when their convoy was ambushed by what appears to be a professional extraction team." The video call's audio picked up Sarah's sharp intake of breath. Even through the secure connection, the implications were clear. The people Robert had spent 40 years opposing weren't going quietly to prison. "Which defendants?" Daniel asked. "The 3 with current intelligence positions, the ones whose testimony could have exposed ongoing operations." Martinez consulted her tablet. "We believe they're being extracted by foreign assets, possibly Elena Kozlov's handlers, who want to prevent their cooperation with American prosecutions." Daniel understood immediately that the situation had escalated beyond courtroom testimony. If the corrupt officials were being protected by hostile intelligence services, the case had become a matter of national security rather than historical justice. "What does this mean for the prosecutions?" "Without their testimony, we lose the ability to prosecute current operations. The historical crimes still stand, but the ongoing criminal enterprises continue operating." Martinez's frustration was evident. "Daniel, your testimony just became significantly more important. You may be our only path to exposing the full scope of the corruption network." Sarah's voice came through the video connection with quiet determination. "Daniel, make the choice. Whatever it is, make it now and commit to it completely." Daniel looked at his wife's face on the screen, thinking about the conversations they'd had in their kitchen in Millbrook when their biggest concerns were mortgage payments and their children's college prospects. That life was already gone, destroyed the moment he'd chosen to investigate his father's secrets rather than selling the aircraft to Marcus Webb. "I'll testify," he said. "Complete cooperation, full disclosure, whatever the prosecutors need." Martinez nodded with professional satisfaction, but Sarah's expression on the screen showed both pride and resignation. She understood, as Daniel was beginning to understand, that they'd just committed their family to a path that would define the rest of their lives. "There's something else," Martinez continued. "The escaped defendants have significant resources and motivation to prevent your testimony. We're moving you to a more secure facility immediately, and your family will be relocated as well." "Where?" "That information is classified until the transfer is complete. But Daniel, you should know once we begin the formal prosecution process, there's no retreating. These people have demonstrated they're willing to kill to protect their secrets." The video call ended with Sarah's promise that she'd explain the situation to Tommy and Lisa as best she could. Daniel was left alone with Martinez, and the understanding that his decision had transformed him from reluctant witness to active target. 2 hours later, he was in an armored vehicle, driving toward a federal facility whose location he wasn't told. Through bulletproof windows, he watched Indiana's familiar landscape scroll past, knowing he might never see it again, as a free man living a normal life. His secure phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your father protected his family by keeping secrets. You're endangering yours by revealing them. Reconsider while you still have the opportunity. A friend." Martinez read the message over his shoulder. "They're getting desperate. The fact that they're making direct threats suggests their extraction operation didn't go as planned. Meaning we may have more leverage than they want us to know. Daniel, in about 6 hours, you're going to be the most important witness in a case that affects national security interests in multiple countries. People who've spent decades building criminal empires are watching their world collapse because one mechanic in Indiana decided to investigate his father's secrets." Daniel thought about Robert's letter, encouraging him to choose family over abstract justice. His father had understood the weight of the choice, but had arranged things so Daniel would have all the information needed to make it freely. "Agent Martinez, if I do this, if I testify and expose everything, what happens to the money? The 800 million in Holocaust assets?" "It gets distributed to survivors and their families, as originally intended. The Swiss Banking Commission has already begun identifying legitimate heirs. Your father's evidence provides the legal foundation for the largest restitution of stolen assets in history." Daniel realized that Robert's real legacy wasn't the secrets he'd kept, but the justice he'd made possible through their eventual revelation. 47 people saved during his operational career, plus potentially thousands of families who would finally receive inheritance that had been stolen from their ancestors. As the armored vehicle continued toward whatever secure facility would house him during the final phase of his father's mission, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: genuine pride in being Robert Reeves's son. The federal courthouse in Chicago stood like a fortress against the October sky, its neoclassical columns and granite facade suggesting permanence and authority that Daniel found both reassuring and intimidating. He'd been in protective custody for 3 weeks, preparing testimony that would expose 40 years of corruption, but nothing had prepared him for the moment when he would face the surviving defendants across a crowded courtroom. Agent Martinez escorted him through security procedures that suggested the government was taking no chances with his safety. Metal detectors, armed marshals, electronic countermeasures, designed to prevent recording or communication with unauthorized parties. The courthouse had been transformed into a secure facility for proceedings that would determine whether decades of institutional corruption would face justice or disappear behind classified restrictions. "Remember," Martinez said as they approached the courtroom, "you're not responsible for the crimes you're exposing. You're only responsible for telling the truth about what you discovered." The prosecutors will handle the legal implications. Daniel nodded, but the weight of responsibility felt heavier than her reassurance suggested. His testimony would either validate his father's 40-year sacrifice or reduce it to a footnote in a case that would be forgotten as soon as the news cycle moved on. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the gallery, federal prosecutors occupied tables laden with documents, and defense attorneys clustered around their remaining clients with the desperate energy of people fighting for their professional lives. But Daniel's attention focused immediately on the defendants themselves, three men in expensive suits, whose faces he recognized from his father's surveillance photographs. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, his professional composure intact despite the circumstances. When he noticed Daniel's entrance, Webb nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that carried no malice or regret. He looked like a man who'd played a long game, skillfully and lost to circumstances beyond his control. Judge Catherine Morrison called the court to order with authority that suggested extensive experience managing high-profile cases. She'd been selected for this trial because of her background in national security law and her reputation for fair but strict courtroom management. "Mr. Reeves," she said as Daniel was sworn in, "you understand that your testimony today concerns matters of national security and international law. Answer only the questions asked, and if you're uncertain about anything, say so rather than speculating." The lead prosecutor, Assistant Attorney General David Chen, approached the witness stand with careful deliberation. Daniel had worked with him during preparation sessions, but facing him in open court felt entirely different. "Mr. Reeves, please tell the court how you first learned about your father's aircraft." Daniel began with the inheritance, the family's mocking reaction, his decision to investigate rather than immediately sell the plane for scrap. As he spoke, he could see jurors leaning forward with interest, drawn into a story that began with ordinary family dynamics, but promised to reveal extraordinary secrets. Chen guided him through each discovery methodically, the hidden compartments, the coded flight logs, the maps and radio frequencies, the Swiss bank key that had triggered everything else. Daniel's mechanical background helped him explain the technical aspects of Robert's evidence distribution system with clarity that made the complexity accessible to civilian jurors. "And what did you find when you activated the electronic key?" "Initially, I thought it had transferred the money to an account controlled by Elena Kozlov's organization. But later investigation revealed that the key had actually triggered multiple simultaneous transmissions, not just banking access codes, but complete copies of all the evidence my father had collected over 40 years. Chen displayed documents on the courtroom screens, bank records, communication intercepts, surveillance reports that detailed the scope of Operation Falcon and its aftermath. Daniel explained each item's significance, describing how Robert's methodical documentation had created an unbreakable chain of evidence. The cross-examination came from Webb's attorney, a silver-haired woman whose questions suggested intimate familiarity with intelligence operations and their legal complications. "Mr. Reeves, isn't it true that you were manipulated by Elena Kozlov's organization, that you provided them with access to classified materials without understanding their true intentions?" "Yes, that's true." "And isn't it also true that your actions triggered the theft of nearly $220 million in assets that had been under appropriate government oversight?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "The money was stolen in 1963. My actions triggered its recovery and return to the families it was stolen from." "But you have no legal training, no background in intelligence operations, no qualification to determine who should control assets recovered from criminal enterprises." "No, I don't. But my father spent 17 years of his career saving people from oppressive regimes and 40 more years protecting evidence that would eventually ensure justice for Holocaust survivors. I think he was qualified to make those determinations." The attorney's expression suggested she'd expected a different response. Daniel realized that his weeks of preparation had taught him to focus on the moral clarity underlying the legal complexity. His father had been trying to do the right thing, even when the right thing required decades of patience and sacrifice. Chen's redirect examination allowed Daniel to explain Robert's final letters, the careful way he'd arranged for the evidence to emerge only through family participation, the built-in safeguards that ensured multiple intelligence agencies would receive complete documentation simultaneously. Your father could have destroyed this evidence at any time during 40 years. Why do you think he preserved it? Daniel looked across the courtroom at Marcus Webb, thinking about the conversation they'd had in the abandoned aircraft when this all began. Because he understood that some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too important to reveal carelessly. He spent 40 years looking for the right way to ensure justice without destroying innocent lives. I think he finally found it. Judge Morrison recessed the court for lunch, but Daniel remained in the witness chair for a few minutes, processing the morning's testimony. Through the courthouse windows, he could see Chicago's skyline stretching toward Lake Michigan, a view that reminded him of the maps his father had marked with flight paths and timing notations. Agent Martinez approached with a secure phone. Daniel, there's been a development. The 3 escaped defendants have been located and recaptured. More importantly, they've decided to cooperate fully with the prosecution in exchange for reduced sentences. Daniel understood immediately that his testimony had served its purpose. The defendants had realized that fighting the evidence was futile, and their best option was negotiating for leniency through cooperation. What does that mean for the rest of the trial? It means your father's mission is complete. The corruption network will be fully exposed, the stolen assets will be returned to their rightful owners, and the ongoing criminal operations will be dismantled. Martinez smiled. It also means your family can begin planning for life after witness protection. As Daniel prepared to complete his testimony, he realized that Robert Reeves's greatest achievement wasn't the people he'd saved during his operational career or the evidence he'd preserved for 40 years. It was the careful way he'd arranged for his son to have the information and support needed to choose justice over safety, truth over comfort, and his father's legacy over his own immediate interests. The afternoon session would conclude Daniel's direct involvement in the case, but it would also mark the beginning of whatever life his family would build in the aftermath of revelations that had changed everything they thought they knew about themselves and their place in history. 2 years later, Daniel Reeves stood beside a bronze memorial plaque mounted on a granite pedestal at the Millbrook Municipal Airfield. The inscription read, "Dedicated to Robert Reeves and the men and women who served in classified operations during the Cold War. Their courage in the shadows helped preserve freedom in the light." The dedication ceremony had drawn a modest crowd. Sarah and the children, Agent Martinez, several families whose relatives had been saved by Robert's wartime operations, and a handful of intelligence veterans whose own service could finally be acknowledged. The rusted Cessna 310 had been restored and now sat permanently beside the memorial, its modifications preserved as historical evidence of covert aviation operations. "It's strange, seeing Dad's name in bronze," Daniel said to Sarah as the crowd dispersed. "He spent so many years being invisible. Maybe that's why this matters." Finally, people know who he really was. The trials had concluded 6 months earlier, with comprehensive convictions. Marcus Webb and his associates had received reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation that exposed corruption networks extending far beyond Operation Falcon. Elena Kozlov and her handlers had been extradited to face charges in multiple countries. Most importantly for Daniel, the Swiss restitution process had distributed over $800 million to Holocaust survivors and their families, the largest such settlement in history. Tommy, now 18 and preparing for college, approached the memorial with the careful respect he'd developed for his grandfather's memory. The past 2 years had changed him from a typical teenager into a young man who understood that family legacies could carry both pride and responsibility. "Dad, the reporter from the Indianapolis Star wants to ask you some questions about the anniversary. You okay with that?" Daniel nodded. He'd grown comfortable with media attention, understanding that his father's story served a purpose beyond their personal situation. The Operation Falcon revelations had triggered congressional investigations, policy reforms, and enhanced oversight of intelligence operations. Robert's patient documentation had created changes that would prevent similar corruption for generations. Lisa, 16, and inheriting her mother's practical wisdom, was less impressed by media attention. "Can we go home now? I've got homework, and this whole hero worship thing gets old after a while." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying the relief of someone who'd survived 2 years of uncertainty and emerged with her family intact. "Your grandfather would probably agree with you. He never wanted to be famous." The reporter was professional and respectful, asking questions about Daniel's current life and how the revelations had affected the family. They'd returned to Millbrook after the trials, though Daniel now worked as a consultant on aircraft restoration projects rather than running his original garage. The community had embraced Robert's legacy with pride, transforming the abandoned airfield into a historical site that attracted visitors from across the country. "Any regrets about pursuing your father's secrets?" the reporter asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. "My father spent 40 years carrying burdens that should have been shared with institutions capable of addressing them properly. I don't regret helping him finally set those burdens down." After the reporter left, the family gathered for dinner at their restored house in Millbrook. The dining room walls now displayed framed photographs of Robert's operational career, pictures that had been classified for decades, but were now part of the public record. Images of him with the people he'd saved, standing beside aircraft in foreign locations, receiving commendations from agencies whose existence wasn't publicly acknowledged until after the trials. "I keep thinking about those 47 people Dad saved," Tommy said over dessert. "I looked up some of them online. Scientists, artists, writers who went on to make important contributions after he got them out of Eastern Europe. Their children and grandchildren have no idea some mechanic from Indiana made their lives possible." Sarah smiled at her son's developing sense of historical perspective. "That's probably how your grandfather preferred it. Results mattered more than recognition." Daniel walked outside after dinner, standing in the backyard, where he'd learned to work with his hands under Robert's patient instruction. The workshop had been rebuilt as a memorial space, displaying tools from his father's legitimate construction career alongside items related to his covert aviation work. Visitors often commented on the seamless integration of ordinary craftsmanship with extraordinary purpose. His secure phone, which he still carried despite the case's conclusion, buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. "Thought you should know. 3 more families identified through Swiss bank records. Holocaust survivors' grandchildren who'll finally receive their inheritance. Your father's work keeps paying forward." Daniel typed back. He'd be satisfied with that. The response came immediately. "He'd be proud of you, Daniel. Not many people would have made the choices you made." As autumn evening settled over Millbrook, Daniel reflected on the transformation of his family's legacy. Robert Reeves was no longer the distant, uncommunicative father who died, leaving more questions than answers. He was now remembered as a man who'd spent his life serving others, even when that service required sacrificing personal relationships and normal family bonds. The memorial plaque at the airfield would outlast everyone who remembered Robert personally, but Daniel understood that the real monument to his father's life wasn't bronze or granite. It was the principle that some truths are worth protecting for decades, even when protection requires enormous personal cost. Sarah joined him in the backyard, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable silence of 23 years of marriage. "Second thoughts about any of it?" she asked. "No. I understand him now, maybe for the first time. Dad wasn't distant because he didn't care about us. He was distant because he cared so much that he was willing to sacrifice closeness for safety. And you, any regrets about following his trail? Daniel looked toward the airfield where his father's aircraft sat under floodlights, preserved as historical testimony to covert heroism. I regret that it took so long to understand who he really was. But I'm grateful he arranged things so I eventually could. Above them, the Indiana sky stretched clear and dark, stars visible in ways they hadn't been during his childhood, when light pollution was less extensive. Daniel imagined his father flying through similar skies decades earlier, navigating by those same stars toward destinations he couldn't discuss with the family he was protecting through his silence. In the distance, the memorial's floodlights illuminated the bronze plaque that would tell future visitors about Robert Reeves and his contribution to freedom's preservation. But for Daniel, the real memorial was simpler and more personal, the understanding that love sometimes expresses itself through distance, protection sometimes requires secrecy, and heroes sometimes labor in shadows for decades before their work can be acknowledged. The Operation Falcon revelations had ended with justice served, corruption exposed, and stolen assets returned to their rightful owners. But for the Reeves family, the real resolution was quieter and more lasting, the peace that comes from finally understanding the choices made by someone whose love was too large to be expressed through conventional means. Tomorrow would bring normal concerns, work deadlines, school events, community responsibilities. But tonight, in the backyard, where a father had once taught his son to work with his hands, Daniel Reeves felt the contentment of a man who'd honored his family's legacy by ensuring it would be remembered for all the right reasons.